My name is Jenny Lobb, and I am the Family and Consumer Sciences educator in Franklin County, and I am a registered dietitian. So today I get to present on a topic that I really enjoy, but I don't always get to teach, and that is nutrition. March is actually National Nutrition Month. Maybe you knew that, maybe that is new to you, but every March, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has a National Nutrition Month to encourage people to learn more about making healthy choices, specifically healthy eating habits. And they have a whole website devoted to that. If you are interested in checking it out, it's nationalnutritionmonth.org. You can, or you can just go online and search National Nutrition Month, and I'm sure it'll pop up. Each year they have a theme, and the theme this year is Personalize Your Plate. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And that academy is a really great resource if you're not familiar with it. For all things nutrition, you can go to their website and find nutrition advice on various topics for various audiences. If you have kids or teenagers and have some questions, they are a really wonderful, credible resource where you can find nutrition information. So it is National Nutrition Month, and maybe you just learned something new right off the bat. I titled our presentation today, What's New in Nutrition? Because there is something that is fairly new this year, the newly released Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The 2020 to 25 edition came out at the very end of 2020. I think it was released quietly that week between Christmas and New Year's. So it was right at the end of 2020 that these were made available. And if you're not familiar with the guidelines, they are released every 5 years. They are published by the USDA and the US Department of Health and Human Services. And it's meant to be a way to systematically review the evidence related to nutrition and make sure that the guidance that is conveyed to the American public is most current and evidence-based. And so they generally stay pretty, the bulk of it is pretty much the same from year to year. There aren't usually any big overhauls or changes, but there are some tweaks and updates that are made. And so I'll talk through the new edition, just kind of a sky high level in the time we have today, some of the key points. If you're interested in reviewing them in more detail, they are publicly available. You can go to the dietaryguidelines.gov website to view the full document in all its 100+ pages if you so desire. I will also say that these guidelines are designed to promote health. So they are designed for everybody to promote health and prevent disease. But you or a loved one may have even more specific dietary guidance. If you live with a chronic condition or have been told by a doctor that you're at high risk for a condition, you may have more specific dietary guidance that's been given by a doctor or a dietitian or a health professional. So these guidelines are kind of like the starting point. They are foundational, they apply to everybody, but there are instances where there may be additional guidance prescribed beyond these guidelines. So the 2020 to 25 edition is kind of mapped out to have 4 key or overarching guidelines. And the first one is to follow a healthy dietary pattern at every life stage. This one was new this year. This was actually the first year that the guidelines have been broken up by age group. So they have always been designed for all Americans, but this year they actually organized them into chapters based on age group. And they did include a chapter for infants and for pregnant and lactating women, and that was new this year. The second guideline is to customize and enjoy nutrient-dense foods and beverages to reflect your personal preferences, cultural traditions, and budgetary considerations. So that's where that theme, the National Nutrition Month theme of personalize your plate, comes in this year. And then the third one is to focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages that will keep you within your calorie limits. And then the fourth one is to limit foods and beverages that are high in added sugar, sodium, and saturated fat, and to limit alcoholic beverages. So those are kind of the 4 key points, the 4 key takeaways. Doesn't sound too difficult, but it's actually broken down even farther. So hopefully this icon, the My Plate icon that is on the slide, is familiar to you. It's been around for a while. This My Plate icon that comes from the USDA was actually designed to complement the dietary guidelines. And I actually heard one researcher who worked on the guidelines describe it in this way, that the guidelines detail what to eat, and My Plate depicts how to follow them. So you take 100 plus pages of detailed recommendations that talk about how to eat to promote health and prevent disease, and then introduce this My Plate icon to let us, the public, know how to do that, how to put it into practice into our daily lives. You may also, if you have a sharp eye, notice that the icon looks just a little bit different. So the My Plate website got a facelift this year. It got an update and a revision along with the updated guidelines. So when the 2020 to 25 guidelines were released, the My Plate website was also redesigned. The image is just a little bit more current perhaps, but the big change is that the website used to be choosemyplate.gov, and they've shortened it to simply myplate.gov. And then because it goes hand in hand with the guidelines, the My Plate website now has specific pages where you can go to get those guidances based on life stage. So there is a page that gives some tips for feeding toddlers if you have little ones at home. There's a page for adolescents, a page for young adults, a page for older adults. So there are different pages within this My Plate website now that provide just a little bit more detailed information. So you don't necessarily have to go and read the guidelines in full. You can still use this My Plate website to get a little bit more information as desired. And so My Plate, as I mentioned, takes the guidelines and even takes those 4 key guidelines and boils them down to this simple image that we can use to put them into practice in our daily lives. So if you recall, that first guideline was to follow a healthy dietary pattern at every life stage. So My Plate is something that everyone can use from throughout the lifespan. Once kiddos start eating, as babies and toddlers, we all need the same nutrients, just in varying amounts. So choosing these foods from My Plate at every life stage is going to provide us with the nutrition that our bodies need to grow and thrive and prevent disease. That second guideline was about personalizing your plate. So choosing foods from my plate, but in various forms, and choosing different items that reflect your budgetary constraints, your lifestyle, your cultural traditions. So, if we think about fruits and vegetables, you could choose fruits and vegetables that are perhaps more common in the United States, like apples, bananas, or oranges, or maybe some tropical fruits if you have cultural traditions and eat some things that may be considered a little bit more exotic. Or if you are really trying to save money, choosing canned or frozen items rather than fresh. So using this My Plate to guide your choices, but personalizing it to fit your lifestyle is what that second guideline is all about. The third one is choosing nutrient-dense foods. And nutrient-dense essentially means foods that have a lot of nutrients relative to the calories they contain. So these food groups on My Plate are nutrient-dense foods: your fruits, your vegetables, your grains, especially your whole grains, and then proteins with the emphasis on lean protein, and dairy alternatives that are low fat are going to provide your body with nutrients, and sometimes little calories, or if they are higher calorie food, there are nutrients along with those calories, so the ratio is good. Whereas foods that you don't see on the plate would be considered energy dense, things that have a lot of calories but very few nutrients. And that's why we have that fourth guideline, which is to limit added sugar, saturated fat, and salt, and alcohol. So trying to limit the things that you don't see on this plate that provide calories, but very few nutrients. So that's how we can use My Plate to put those 4 key recommendations into practice. And this is a screenshot on this slide that comes directly from the guidelines that I think just provides a really nice rationale for why it's so important to use My Plate. So the research suggests that for the average person, to meet your nutrient needs on a daily basis without taking supplements or anything like that, you would need to consume about 85% of your daily calories from those nutrient-dense foods, from those My Plate food groups, if you want to meet your nutritional needs without going over your calorie needs for the day. And that only leaves 15% for what we would call discretionary purposes, so your sweets and treats, and really your things that we think of more as junk food that may be higher in added sugar and saturated fat and sodium. And here's where we're at. This is another screenshot that comes directly from the guidelines. So we all have room to improve. And there's another picture, I didn't include it in this presentation, but there's another image from the guidelines themselves that breaks down how people are scoring on these recommendations by age group. And the highest ones are at the bookends. So typically, young children and older adults tend to be doing the best when it comes to meeting the guidelines. But even so, they're only about in that 60% range. So we all have room to improve, because even if you're at the top of the class, but you're only getting a D on your exam, that's not really going to cut it. So we all have room to improve. Currently, only about 25% of us are getting enough fruits and vegetables a day. 63% of us are over consuming sugar, 77% are over consuming saturated fat, and 90% are over consuming sodium. And I'm going to take a little bit closer look at each of those last 3 with you now, starting with sodium. So the recommendation for sodium is no more than a teaspoon a day. for individuals 50 and younger. That's about 2,300 milligrams, and no more than 1,500 milligrams a day for individuals over 50, African Americans, and those who have already been diagnosed with a condition like high blood pressure or diabetes or kidney disease, or are otherwise been told that they are at risk for heart disease. So here's a question for you, and if you want to open up the chat box, you can share your guesses with me. How much do you think the average American, how much sodium do you think the average American consumes per day in milligrams? The recommendation is no more than a teaspoon, 2,300 for individuals under 50, no more than 1,500 milligrams for those over 50. How much do you think the average American consumes in a day? I'm getting a wide range of responses here. I have 3,500, 5,000, 10,000. Yeah, the average is right around 3,400. So it's actually at the lower end of those guesses you're providing. But even still, that's you know, that's twice, that's over twice the limit for those who are at greater risk for heart disease. So we all have room to improve in this regard. And what do you think some of the top sources of sodium are in our diets? Again, you can use that chat box to share with me. I see seasonings, processed foods, fast food. Yeah, you guys are right on it. So the majority of the sodium that we consume on a daily basis comes from packaged or processed or restaurant foods, especially fast foods. Let's see. Some of these top sources are things that you think of, you might get in the frozen food aisle or at a fast food restaurant, or otherwise packaged things like your frozen pizza or chicken, your canned soup, your cold cuts, deli meats, and so forth. So one of the best things you can do to try to limit your sodium consumption is use that nutrition facts panel, especially when you're shopping in those areas of the grocery store where you're buying something that is packaged and it has a nutrition facts label. You can look at that and look for the sodium to try to make some better choices in that regard. We like to use something called the quick guide rule to the daily value, which is that portion of the nutrition facts panel that's on the right. And in general, if a nutrient has 5% or less of your daily value, it is considered a low source of that nutrient. If it has 20% or more, it's considered a high source of that nutrient. And this can be good or bad depending on what you're looking at. So if you're looking at sodium and you see that a can of soup, for example, has 30-40% your daily value of sodium, that's a food that's a really high source of sodium, not so great. You can use it to look at anything though. You can use it if you're trying to look for things that are a good source of, say, calcium or potassium or iron. You can use that panel and that rule to look for foods that are good sources of those nutrients that we need. You can also use that panel to make better choices if you're trying to limit your saturated fat content. Again, the dietary guidelines recommend that we limit saturated fat. And we do need some fat in our diets. So fat does play an important role in the way our body functions. It provides cushioning for nerves and our organs, and it helps with hormone regulation. But too much fat is not a good thing. So the amount and the type make a difference. And there are unsaturated, both mono and polyunsaturated fats, saturated, and then trans fats. The American Heart Association calls them the good, the bad, and the ugly. So they would consider the unsaturated the good, and the saturated the bad, and then the trans the ones that you really want to avoid. So you can use that nutrition facts panel again to try to look for foods that, if they are high in fat, that have a better ratio of unsaturated to saturated. You can also just use your visuals. So your saturated tend to be solid at room temperature. They come from animal sources, your meat, your cheese, your butter, and so forth. Whereas your unsaturated tend to come from plant sources. Your cooking oils, your avocado, your nuts, those are sources of unsaturated fat. So choosing unsaturated over saturated as much as you're able is one step you could take to achieve that recommendation. And then the final portion of that recommendation is to limit added sugar intake. And like everything else, you can use the nutrition facts panel to look for added sugars in your food. The updated nutrition facts panel actually includes a separate line specifically for added sugar, which is helpful because we know that many foods contain natural sugars, things like fruit and dairy foods. They will contain some natural sugars, and what we really want to limit is sugar that has been added, because unlike some of those other nutrients, the added sugar doesn't have any nutritional value for our bodies. It makes things taste good, but it doesn't have a nutritional value. And so really, you could try to limit your added sugar as much as possible from a nutritional standpoint, but the recommendations in the guidelines are 10% or less of your daily calories. I like the American Heart Association guidelines a little bit better because it's more visual. So the American Heart Association recommends limiting your added sugar intake to 6 teaspoons a day for women, 9 teaspoons a day for men. And there are 4 grams in a teaspoon. That's a really nice visual, because if you look at that nutrition facts label and you see that a food has, say 24 grams of added sugar, you can quickly do that sugar math. You divide by 4, and that lets you know that, oh, hey, that food has 6 teaspoons of added sugar. And I don't know about you, but when I think about, if I would sit there and just eat spoonfuls of sugar, that helps me make better choices and maybe avoid some of those foods using that sugar math and that visual. So those are the recommendations. Putting it all together, I actually borrowed this image from the previous edition of the dietary guidelines, the 2015 to 2020, because I really like it. Really what we're encouraging, what we're all encouraged to do with these guidelines is to make shifts in our diets, in our lifestyles, from less nutritious foods to more nutritious foods. So there are some examples provided here, maybe shifting from whole milk to low-fat milk if you're trying to limit your saturated fat, or maybe shifting from butter to oil in your cooking. You're trying to limit your sugar intake, shifting from soda or sweet tea to water, coffee, unsweet tea, and so forth. So making those shifts is kind of the key takeaway here. What other examples of shifts might you make in your own diet? can go ahead and share your ideas in the chat box if you have more examples or ideas of shifts that you might make. And as you're thinking about that, I will also share an image that comes from the current guidelines. This is an example of an entire meal that's been made over. So on the left, there's a picture of what might be a typical burrito bowl. It has white rice and cheese and sour cream and guacamole. And then on the right, there's a more nutrient dense version of a burrito bowl. So what you can see here is that the quantity of the rice has been reduced, and instead of white rice, you see brown rice, and you see some more vegetables. You see the romaine lettuce. Reduced sodium beans have been used. The chicken has been grilled, so maybe prepared in a more healthy way. There's sliced avocado. Rather than the guacamole, there's some really colorful and delicious looking bell pepper strips. So, so thinking about how you can limit maybe those condiments, the things like the sour cream or the guacamole, and have the fresh vegetables to help fill you up and provide nutrients is really what making those shifts and putting the guidelines into practice is all about. And I see some of you are sharing your examples. So, so Amy shares that instead of regular pasta, she's using chickpea pasta. That's definitely an option. Even making a shift to whole grain pasta might be a step, or mixing, in your pasta dishes, doing half and half. So you're half normal pasta and half whole grain pasta. Or even adding in some vegetables to provide the volume with less of that carbohydrate. Trying to avoid packaged snacks and using fresh things like fresh fruits. You could grab a whole piece of fruit to take out the door, or bagging up some fresh grapes or sliced vegetables. Those make really nice grab and go snacks. See someone, mixing your whole wheat flour with your all-purpose in your baking. So these are all great ideas. Thank you for sharing those. You can continue to share as you would like as we wrap up. I will also leave some time for questions. If you have any lingering questions, I'm happy to address those. I'm also sharing my contact information. If you have a question for the dietitian you want to ask more privately, you're welcome to reach out to me by email or phone. And I do also want to share before we go today some upcoming webinars that'll be offered by our team. If you're interested in coming back next month, we have a team member who will be talking about healthy sleep, and then you can save the date for some additional topics in May or June if you're interested in joining us for more Wellness Wednesday webinars in the future. So I'll go ahead and share the registration in the chat box for that April webinar if you're interested. And I will also share it in via email. I will send out the recording of today's session and share that through email. So you'll have it that way as well. I think, Amy, do we also have a poll we can go ahead and launch? Yes, so if you don't mind taking a moment to respond to a quick poll for me before you go today, I would appreciate it. And again, I'll stay on to answer any questions that you may have. And otherwise, I wish you a wonderful Wednesday afternoon. I will send the recording of today's session to you by email, so you will be able to click on the link to the recording and listen to it that way.